Hi, I'm Kathy Anderson. I'm glad you're here. If you're interested in the intersection of criminal justice and psychology, if you're interested in serial killers and murderers and people who engage in antisocial behavior and what makes them tick, what made them that way, you're in the right place. Let's discuss the biological and social roots of crime. So this is Jeffrey Landrigan, born March 17, 1962. Never knew his father, was left by his mother in a daycare facility. She dropped him off and never came back. But Jeffrey got lucky. He was adopted by a loving family and brought into their home, where he would have everything that a child could want. However, by age 2, he was engaging in extraordinary tantrums, and he was clearly emotionally dysregulated. By age 10, he was abusing alcohol. By age 11, he had undergone his first arrest for burglary of a home. He was skipping school, he was abusing drugs, stealing cars, and was in and out of detention centers. By age 20, he was hanging out with his best friend who wanted him to be the godfather to his newborn baby. But they were out drinking, they got into a tussle, and Jeffrey stabbed him to death outside of his friend's trailer. He was arrested for this, and by 1982, when he was 20 years old, he was serving a 22-year sentence for second-degree murder. Remarkably, 7 years later, he escaped from prison and took himself off to Phoenix, Arizona. There, he stabbed and strangled Chester Dyer. He left pornographic playing cards around the room where he stabbed him and left the ace of hearts on his back. Unfortunately for Jeffrey, he left a footprint in sugar that had spilled near the front door, and he was subsequently arrested for the crime and sentenced to death row in Arizona. While he was on death row, he met a con man who said that he knew somebody who looked exactly like Jeffrey, the spitting image of him, he said. Turns out this man was Darrell Hill, and the two had met on death row. Darrell Hill also had early criminality. He also had a history of being a drug addict, just like Jeffrey. He also, just like Jeffrey, had killed 2 times and escaped prison. His own father was also an institutionalized criminal, and in fact, Darrell had seen his father gunned down by police when Darrell was 21 years old, while the police were trying to arrest him for robbery. Maybe Darrell himself said it best when he said, "It don't take anyone too smart to look at 3 generations of outlaws and see there's a link of some kind. There's a pattern." For sure, Mr. Hill. So as a psychologist, what we discuss is a diagnosis called antisocial personality disorder. This is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, which is what we're using now. And you don't need to know all of these details, but I want to point out a couple of things to you. ASPD is a pervasive pattern that's characterized by arrest, lying, impulsivity, aggressiveness, recklessness for safety of self and others, irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. They're incapable of remorse for the things that they do. Now, more colloquially, we might discuss psychopaths or sociopaths. Now, there's a lot of debate about what these terms mean. As I mentioned, in psychology, we talk about antisocial personality disorder. We don't talk about psychopaths and sociopaths particularly. Psychopaths, but as best I could convey to you the gist of the debate, here's what shakes out of the debate, that both a psychopath and a sociopath would probably be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They would both disregard laws and social norms, disregard the rights of others. They would not feel remorse or guilt, and they would be violent and aggressive. But then they diverge. A psychopath is predatory. The psychopath uses other people as objects for amusement. They tend to be kind of fun. They're good actors. They have a high IQ. They tend to be very charming. They can win people over. But in fact, they are incapable of empathy. They can fake relationships and mimic emotions, so they may have people around them and may even be married, but it's not real. A sociopath, on the other hand, is a nervous, agitated, volatile, rageful, outbursting kind of an individual. They probably live and operate on the fringe of society. If you saw a sociopath, you would know that they were obviously disturbed, whereas a psychopath, you'd never know at first. They tend not to have very many attachments because they're minimally capable of empathy. Their crimes are not predatory, they're not planned, they tend to be haphazard. How do these two develop? They have different developmental trajectories. A psychopath was probably largely born this way, largely biological. Probably there's some environmental influences too, but a lot of it is going to be biological. The sociopath, on the other hand, probably has some biological vulnerabilities, but his path is largely environmental, probably a lot of abuse in this person's childhood. So let's think a little bit about the biological bases of behavior, of this kind of behavior, and then we'll think a little bit more about the social aspect as well, the environmental aspect. Let's start with a twin study. Twin studies are really useful at kind of teasing apart what part might be biological or genetic and what part might be environmental. So this is a landmark study that was done in Denmark. And what they did was they counted up the number of criminal offenses of the biological parents. Maybe it was 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or more. And then but these boys were adopted away from these parents and put in other homes. So you've got children who have a biological parent who's a criminal or not, and adopted away into another home. And what you see is that there is an increase in the homicide rates of these adoptees as a function of the degree of criminal offending of the biological parents. A son who is adopted away from a family that a biological family that didn't commit offenses doesn't have a particularly high rate of conviction, but by the time you get to 3 or more, it's pretty high. There are more than a dozen other studies that find the same kind of a result. So let's think about it's not genetic. Let me go back to this. It's not genetic. It's not that these boys were born with murder genes. That's not what it is. What they were born with were biological predispositions that would be genetic in nature that would influence the way their biological makeup was. So let's start with the heart. It turns out that a normally functioning conscience requires a normally functioning autonomic nervous system. So violent people, it turns out, have fearless autonomic nervous systems. A low resting heart rate is as good at predicting who is a serial killer as a mammogram is at predicting who has breast cancer. That's a pretty darn good predictor. Turns out that men tend to have a lower resting heart rate than women do. And of course, you probably realize it's also true that men commit the majority of very violent crimes. A low resting heart rate tends to predict a number of things. It predicts lower levels of fear, lower levels of empathy, and lower levels of arousal. So now notice here we're talking about your resting heart rate. It's not that the murderer who's in the act of committing murder doesn't have a fast heartbeat. He probably does. And he may vomit and have the same kinds of biological reactions that the rest of us would to something like that. But when they're just sitting around and at ease and not really doing anything, the resting heart rate is quite low. And what that means is that they're not as afraid. And they have lower levels of arousal generally. Now, people find low levels of arousal, very low levels of arousal, unpleasant. We also find very high levels of arousal unpleasant. And each person kind of has their set point for what they like. Some people are sensation seekers and really like to have a lot of arousal. It's possible that people with ASPD or people who are psychopaths have low resting heart rates. And so they need a higher level of arousal, and they don't react to fear quite as strongly. Here's a couple of supplementary studies for you. Preschool boys with a lower resting heart rate are more antisocial and more hyper. And if they have a choice of what kind of video they'd like to watch, they'll choose the angry videos every time. A lower heart rate at age 2 also predicts aggressive behavior at age 11. Now let's look at the brain. Antisocial people have smaller and more asymmetrical brains than other people. Now let me flesh this out so you'll understand exactly what that means. Because it isn't true that their overall brain size is smaller. People with ASPD have about the same amount of brain generally, but they do have less matter in particular areas. 11% reduction in gray matter up here, a 9% reduction in the orbitofrontal gyrus, a 16% reduction in the ventromedial PFC, prefrontal cortex, and a 20% reduction in the middle frontal gyrus. These are all right up here. Now, put your hand on the back of your head, right at the base of your skull. Right there, you're doing all of your, this is like your lower brain, your reptilian brain, where you're doing all of your stuff like breathing, just sort of basic biological functions. Right here in the middle, so right about here in this brain that's been opened up, is your limbic system. And then right up here is your prefrontal cortex. This is the highest level of the brain. This is the part of the brain that is not as developed in chimpanzees and other animals. So a psychopath and a person with ASPD has less matter up here. Well, what do we do up here? Well, we do planning. We do moral decision making. We do that fear conditioning where we learn to feel uneasy about doing immoral things. We inhibit our impulses. We delay gratification. We engage in empathy. We evaluate our thoughts to see if they're okay or not. We engage in sensitivity to others' emotions. We regulate our own emotions. We learn from our mistakes. We're doing all of that up here, and people with ASPD don't have nearly as much matter there as the rest of us. The amygdala, I mentioned the limbic system is right in here. The amygdala and the hippocampus are structures in the limbic system. The amygdala is a little almond-shaped structure, and it's involved in emotion, particularly fear. So a smaller amygdala leads to reduced fear conditioning. How did they get a smaller amygdala? It was probably something that happened prenatally. There was probably a health insult, nicotine, alcohol, some other kind of teratogen, possibly a genetic mutation that caused a smaller amygdala, and therefore less fear and less fear conditioning. Now, everybody has an asymmetrical hippocampus. We have part of the hippocampus on one side of the brain and part on the other. The hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure, and it's involved in memory, and it's also involved in emotion. And they have a more asymmetrical hippocampus than other people do. What does that mean? That means less fear conditioning, and it also means less regulation of aggression. Here's a couple of interesting supporting details for that. Rat pups who switch homes a lot. So you take your little rat pups in the lab and you move them from home to home when they're very young. They have more asymmetry in the hippocampus, which leads to reduced fear conditioning and aggression regulation. Guess what? Psychopaths also tend to switch homes a lot, and on average 7 times compared to 3 for non-psychopaths. Fetal alcohol syndrome causes asymmetry in the hippocampus. So again, we have that health insult during prenatal development. Could there be a difference, do you think, between, say, a one-time impulsive murderer, somebody who, gets into a fight and it goes too far and they end up killing somebody, or a person who's in a home invasion and the homeowner wakes up and attacks them and it goes south and the homeowner ends up dead? Could there be a difference between that kind of a murderer and, say, a serial murderer? Somebody who plans the attacks, plans how to get the people, plans how to keep them, plans how to dispose of bodies, plans how to stay under the radar of the police, plans how to blend in with society so that they can continue their habit. I'm going to guess that there's probably some kind of a difference between these two. So let's look at the brain functioning of these two types of murderers. So this is a PET scan, and this is a bird's eye view, which means that right up here and right here is this. That's the prefrontal cortex. This is a normal person, and this is a murderer, a one-time murderer. Now, red and yellow indicates a lot more brain functioning. Now, these PET scans have been taken during a visual task. one of those tasks where you have to like stare at lights and you have to really concentrate and focus. And so what we would expect is that the occipital lobe, right back here, this is your occipital lobe, and that's where you do all your processing of visual information. And look, that's pretty equally lit up from the normal person to the murderer, a little bit less over here. But look what's really a remarkable difference. It's this. The part of the brain that has to focus on the task really hard is lit up like a Christmas tree in the normal person and barely lit up at all in the murderer. This would suggest, if we don't have much activation up here, that this is a person with poor emotional control, poor self-control, poor social skills, poor cognitive flexibility and problem solving, and that they engage in increased risk-taking, irresponsibility, and rule-breaking. Here is PET scans, again, showing the same kind of view. This is a normal person, and this is an impulsive murderer named Antonio Bustamante. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Here's the deal with Antonio. Antonio Bustamante was tantamount to an altar boy. He was as good as it gets until the age of 20, when he was hit with a crowbar right in the front of his head, damaging his prefrontal cortex. After that, he began acting like a lifelong recidivistic criminal. In fact, he was arrested 29 times. He committed breaking and entering, strong-arm robbery. After the injury, he became recklessly impulsive and emotionally labile. We know that damage to this area of the brain reduces emotion regulation and impairs decision-making. It is very, very likely, and this information was brought up at Bustamante's trial, that his injury with a crowbar at age 20 had damaged his prefrontal cortex to the point where he was no longer capable of being the person he was before and making the same kinds of decisions about behavior. He did end up murdering somebody in the act of his robbery. Now, this is a different sort of person altogether. This is a guy named Randy Kraft, known as the scorecard criminal, the scorecard killer. He killed 64 people in 12 years. His crimes are absolutely heinous. I can't describe it to you because it's so awful. He finally got arrested because he was pulled over for an illegal lane change, but he had a victim in the back seat, and that's how he got caught. Also in the car was a diary that he kept. That's why he's called the scorecard killer. A diary he kept where he kept score of all the people he had killed. So what we see here is a brain scan of a normal person, a multiple murder, a serial killer. In fact, this is Randy Kraft's brain scan. Here is a one-time impulsive murder like Bustamante or another person like that. And then this is the brain scan of a psychologist, psychiatrist, and criminologist named Adrian Raine, who is the author of the book that I'm pulling a lot of this information from. The book is referenced at the end of this PowerPoint. It's a fascinating read if you'd like to take a look at that. He's a wonderful author. So let's take a look at this. So we've got a normal person. We've got the serial killer, Randy Kraft. We've got a one-time murderer, and we've got Adrian Raine, our author. Which two look alike? I don't know about you, but I would say these two look alike. And this fact is not lost on Dr. Raine either. He's well aware that his brain scan looks an awful lot like Randy Kraft's. So, but look at the difference between the multiple murderer and the murderer. Again, remember, very little prefrontal cortex activation here, but do you see a lot of prefrontal cortex activation here in his brain? In fact, do you see more than a normal person? Yeah. His brain is hugely lit up, especially up here. What that tells us is that a serial killer is actually somebody who has very high prefrontal cortex activation. They're very good at planning. They're actually very good at inhibition of impulses. They're actually very good at planning and decision-making and thinking things through and delay of gratification. They plan all of their murders out. Okay. Historically, there have been some crackpot theories about people with atavistic features being criminals. Atavistic means that it's a physical feature that harkens back to an earlier stage of human development. Largely crackpot stuff. You can't just like look at a person and say, oh yes, sloping forehead or something like that. But, and I want you to be cautious with this information I'm going to share with you. Are there any telltale signs? Well, it turns out that there are a few little minor physical anomalies that are in fact related to antisocial behavior. Not to killers, but to antisocial behavior. So if you hold your hand and let your fingers kind of curl in and look at it, if you see only a single palmar crease as opposed to multiple, you can see I have multiple, I'm not a serial killer, not antisocial. If you have a single palmar crease, that's one of a collection of minor anomalies that's related to antisocial behavior. Another one is the digit ratio. What we're looking at here is the ratio of the second digit, which is your pointer finger, to the fourth digit, which is your ring finger. So most women have a ratio like this where it's pretty equal. For most men, the ring finger is going to be a little bit longer than the pointer finger. More feminine people tend to have a very long pointer. And if you're a man and you have the long pointer compared to your ring, you probably have more anxiety and a lower sperm count. If you are a woman and you have this ratio, you perhaps are more feminine and more susceptible to breast cancer. But what if you have a very long ring finger compared to the pointer? In a man, what this shows is this is a person who's more masculine. There's more psychopathy associated with this, a longer penis, autism, aggression, female homosexuality, being dominant, being sensation-seeking, being impulsive, and hyperactive children. So what's going on here? Here's the deal. It seems to be related to testosterone. Higher levels of testosterone, more androgenized, and you get these kinds of traits. Less testosterone, less androgenized, and you get these kinds of traits. There are three others. A big toe gap. So just stand normally and look down, and do you have a large gap between the large toe and the toe next to it? Take a look at your ears. Your ear connected, or also called adherent, and also is it low? And then finally a curved little finger. This one in particular, the low ear, when we're developing in the womb, the eyes actually start out on the side of the head and they migrate forward. And the ears start out low and they migrate up. And so what they think has happened with these particular anomalies is that if you have one or two, but if you have multiple of them, that something happened prenatally to disrupt development. There was some kind of a teratogen that caused a higher level of testosterone, and the higher level of testosterone causes higher level of aggression. So there was something that disrupted development so that the ear didn't migrate fully up. There was something that happened in development that caused the pinky to curve. So listen, you got to be careful with this information, all right? Number one, if you have one or two of these, don't go around and start worrying that you're going to become antisocial. First of all, it takes a cluster. Second of all, even if you have the cluster, that's not determinative. It is related to antisocial behavior. Also, please don't go around looking at people's hands and feet and making determinations about what kind of people they are. All right, that caveat aside, it's an interesting little thing. And it is a pretty robust finding in the literature. But, environment matters too. Primarily what I wanted to bring you today was information on the biology of antisocial behavior, but I would be remiss if I did not touch on environmental influences as well. So we said before that the psychopath over here, charming, cool guy who seems perfectly nice and a lot of fun until he starts to manipulate you, is probably biologically wired up that way from birth. We said that the sociopath, the person who looks he's on the fringe, looks disturbed, probably has a biological predisposition, but a lot of his behavior is caused by environmental influences. A person with antisocial personality disorder probably has a lot of biological influences. A person who simply behaves antisocially but is not diagnosed with the disorder, and I should say, I believe it's about a 2% rate, 2 to 3% rate of antisocial personality disorder in the general population. But of course, there are people who behave antisocially without having a diagnosis. They probably have a mix of biological and environmental influences. Let's think about what those environmental influences might be and how much of a influence they might have. So this study is based on 397 participants. And they had wonderful longitudinal data. They had data on these people when they were born, and they had early neurological and neuromotor measures. So could they hold their head up on time? Could they roll over on time? Did they say their first words on time? Those kinds of things. They also had obstetric information. Was it a difficult birth? Was there any hypoxia? Was there use of forceps or suction or anything like that? Was there trauma during birth? They also had family and social data. So was the mother rejecting? Was there disruption in the family structure? Was there divorce? Was there maternal warmth or not? And then they found out the crime rates when these people turned 23 years old. So the rate of violence, so they separated out. They had a control group that didn't seem to have any risk factors. They had a group that was just living in poverty. They had a group that had neuromotor issues. So there was they didn't hold their head up on time, didn't walk on time, that kind of thing. And then they had a group that was biosocial, had biosocial risk factors. So they had biological risk factors as well as the family risk factors. So they also lived in poverty. They also had maternal rejection. So notice what you see. Okay, so these white bars are the controls, low levels of violence. This light gray bar is poverty. And so you can see that as a risk factor for criminality. Now we have total crime, we have thievery, and then we have violence. Okay. And then we have the neuromotor, and then we have the biosocial. Okay. So clearly one of these four groups is at much higher risk for crime, and that is the biosocial group. The rate of violence in poverty only group was only 3.5%. compared to 12.5% for the biosocial group, which was a threefold increase. The biosocial group had 14 times the rate of violence as the control group, and they accounted for 70% of all crimes perpetrated by the entire sample. So do you see the gist here? Just poverty is a risk factor. Just biological insults is a risk factor. But if you put together all of them, and you add in maternal rejection and a disruptive family, then you start to get some serious risk factors for criminality and violence. One more study, and then we'll wrap it up. Again, on the biosocial model of violence. This is a study on adolescents from Australia. There were four groups based on either biological risk or social risk. So biological risk, again, birth complications, neurocognitive deficits, or social risk. Poverty, low socioeconomic status, low maternal warmth, maternal hostility, lack of monitoring, changes in marital status. So if we look at this, we can see here's low social risk and here's high social risk, and then here's the percent of adolescents who became aggressive. And it turned, so if you can see, if you are high biological risk and low social risk, you're really no different from low biological risk and low social risk. But boy, look at that. High social risk and low biological risk gets you an increase, but put the two of them together, and now we've got a significant problem. So low biological and high social, you get an increase, but low biological and high social, a massive increase. 65% of the biosocial group who had both sets of risk factors had serious aggressive outcomes, compared with only 25% with social risk only, and 17% with biological risk only, compared to 12% of the controls. All right, folks, that was a long tour, a lot of information. I'll make my PowerPoint available to you so that you can look back at that. So we took a look at the biological and social roots of crime. We saw with the autonomic nervous system that if you have a low resting heart rate, you have less empathy and less fear and lower levels of arousal. We saw with brain structure that the prefrontal cortex is smaller, the amygdala is smaller, the hippocampus is asymmetrical. What this causes is a person who is not good at inhibiting their impulses. They're not responsive to fear conditioning. They're not good at planning things out. They're not good at delay of gratification. We saw that there was a difference in cortical functioning between the impulsive killer and the serial killer. The impulsive killer doesn't have much going on up here, but the serial killer is lit up like a Christmas tree because he's planning everything out. We saw that minor anomalies are a marker for higher levels of testosterone in the womb, and higher levels of testosterone are known to relate to higher levels of aggression. And then finally, we saw that social environment matters a lot. If you put together the biological predispositions with a high-risk social environment characterized by low maternal warmth, disruption in the family, remember those rat pups who moved a lot? Then you've got a recipe for aggression and antisocial behavior. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks.